Welcome to this lecture on the training principle of individuality and age appropriateness. Before we get started, we will talk about individuality and age appropriateness, and I have dissected it in this lecture. So we have parts where we talk about individuality, and then we have parts where we talk about age appropriateness. Let's get started. You can't make a donkey into a racehorse. What does that mean? We'll get into that. So what will we cover in this lecture? We look at the basic premise of this principle. We look at the biological basis of this principle of individuality and age appropriateness, and we look at the practical application. So before we get started, the principle of individuality, in my opinion, is one of the least understood or most misunderstood, because it puts the individuality at the center of it. And when we go through our outline of the different categorizations, the individuality will come later in the process of eliciting and maintaining adaptations. Very often, the principle of individuality serves as a fundament for people. But again, let's have a look at this principle. The principle of individuality. What is the basic premise of this principle? The performance of an athlete is the sum of an interplay of different factors. What does that mean? For an optimal development of an athlete, these different factors need to be considered and addressed. What are these factors? They can be divided into nature and nurture. If you're not familiar with the terms of nature and nurture is basically internal factors and nurture is external factors. Nature can be genetic inheritance and predispositions, as well as biological factors such as anthropometry. There are a few more. Nurture are external factors that could be education, experience, behavior. Yeah? So if we look at age appropriateness, the World Health Organization stated in their position paper in 2008, children are not mini adults, and therefore they should not be treated like adults because they are somewhat unique. What's the biological basis for this principle? So let's look at individuality first. The underlying biological principle is the individual adaptability. We talked about adaptation as the biological principle and adaptation as the main rule of training, according to Kramer and Satsiowski and myself. So, the underlying biological principle behind this principle of individuality and age appropriateness is the individual adaptability, the magnitude of individual adaptability, and the maximal functional capacity. So keep that in mind. We'll get into that in the practical application. The individual adaptability, the magnitude, and the maximal functional capacity is different between individuals. And again, we can't make a donkey into a racehorse. So what's the biological basis for age appropriateness? First things first. During adolescence, the human goes through different stages of growth and development. What does that mean? What's the difference between growth and development? And this is from an upcoming course on long-term athlete development. Growth refers to the measurable physical change of a human. And we can see, you have probably seen that before. This is the growth curve of a human. You can see that there's a steady rate of growth. Then there is a spike in growth called the growth spurt. Then there is a point where the growth is highest, peak height velocity. And then there is a decrease of growth and a cessation of growth. And that changes between genders. Yeah? So girls mature a bit earlier than boys, but the magnitude is also different between the two. So this is an example of growth. But then we also have, now that here we come to the combination of age appropriateness and individuality. Different individuals go through that development and this growth, the growth at different stages. So we have normal developers, we have early developers, also called accelerated, and we have late developers, also called retarded. Retarded in the sense of growth, not in the sense of mental. So just remember, normal developers, early developers, late developers. If we look at development, that refers to the cognitive, functional, and emotional change. And we'll get into that in the practical application. There we are, practical application. So what's the practical application of this principle of individuality and age appropriateness? Let's start with individuality. I know people will love this slide because it's very, very complicated. So, Professor Tito, I was fortunate to learn under him during the early days in my studies. He kind of came up with the idea that there are different adaptive types. And he came up with this model that there's a limit of the current individual performance, and then we have a type A, type B, and type C. And what he said is that different types have a different adaptive reserve, which means that the maximal individual performance is different for different types. Yeah? And he said the type A is a type where adaptation takes much longer. He came up with a 7-month adaptation type. Type B is a 5-month adaptation type. And the type C is a 3-month adaptation type. But again, complicated. But essentially what it says is what we said before. The individual adaptability is different. The magnitude is different. And the maximal functional capacity. Yeah, so if we go back here, individually, we can see the magnitude is different between A, B, and C, which also leads to the maximal capacity being different between type B, and type C. Oops, oh, there we have it. Individual adaptability, magnitude, functional capacity. And again, what can we learn? You can't make a donkey into a racehorse. But there's a big but. And this is what we have to do as coaches. You can make the donkey into the best donkey it could possibly be. Let's look at age appropriateness. We said the basic premise is that children are not little adults, so therefore they shouldn't be treated like adults. This is something I've made with a colleague of mine, former colleague of mine, Terry Peters. Shout out to Terry here. We looked at the structure in the football club and we looked at how should training be done in the younger age groups and how can we give the younger age groups a better chance to succeed at the professional level. And unfortunately, very often what you see is whatever the professionals do, some form of that training is done at the younger age groups as well. But again, what did the WHO say? Children are not mini adults. So why should the children and youth athletes train the same as the adult athletes? And then we divided the age groups into the phases of pre-puberty, puberty, post-puberty, and adulthood. And we used the terminology of Balji from his LTAD approach, learning to train, training to train, training to compete, and training to win. And then we came up with a fact sheet, guidelines, how training should look in these different age groups. Yeah, sorry, I had to make it blurred here because, well, there's information we wanted to keep for the club. But anyway, the idea is children are not mini adults and they have to go through a different training regimen which is appropriate to their age. Therefore, the principle of age appropriateness. So, there was one thing. We also talked about the definition of development, which is the cognitive, functional, and emotional change of a human. And again, shameless plug here. This is from my upcoming course on long-term athlete development, where you can see, and this is again, shout out to Kelvin Giles. He has done that in his book, where they looked at different attributes, abilities and constraints and implications for training. And then here we have an example of the childhood, the functional development, for the pre-puberty, the cognitive development, and the puberty, the emotional development. In that course, you'll get all the information for the different age groups. So that brings us to the end of the principle of, I just see, individuality. So individuality is that supposed to mean, and age appropriateness. We talked about the basic premise of that principle. We looked at the biological basis of that principle, and we looked at the practical application. Yeah. So remember, the basic premise was you can't make a donkey into a racehorse, but you can make the donkey into the best donkey it can possibly be. The biological basis, the individuality, different people have a different individual capacity to adapt, and children are not mini adults. They go through different stages of growth and development. And we looked at the practical application, how we use this information for the training. I see you in the next one, when we look at the principle of increasing specificity. If you've missed the previous one on periodization and cyclization, check it out here, and don't forget to subscribe.